If you were planning to take the LSAT remotely, you've got to think carefully about your timeline. April and June 2026 may be your last realistic opportunities to take the LSAT from home as a general option. Beginning with the August 2026 administration, LSAC is moving toward in center testing for almost all test takers in the US and internationally. Remote testing will still technically exist, but only for documented medical accommodations or extreme hardship. And so, for most people, the default is going to be going back to a testing center. Now, before anybody panics, let's be clear, the content of the LSAT is not changing. The structure also is not changing. Neither is the scoring scale or the skills being tested. And LSAC was explicit about this in their recent announcement. So we've still got logical reasoning and reading comprehension as the foundation of the exam. LSAC also reaffirmed what they call the LSAT's predictive validity and reliability, meaning there are no new question types, there's no hidden shift in emphasis, they're not bringing back logic games, so your study strategy doesn't need to change. But what does change is the environment. Now, in their announcement this week, LSAC wrote, and I quote here, moving toward in center testing will provide another important deterrent to anyone who tries to undermine the integrity of the test. And that sentence tells you the core reason in a nutshell. It is integrity of the test. And this follows the organized misconduct during remote administrations, including proxy test taking, meaning someone else taking it for you, or the theft of unreleased LSAT content. LSAC previously suspended online LSAT testing in mainland China after they discovered coordinated efforts that involved capturing unreleased exam material in real time. Because the sad truth is that LSAC does reuse unreleased material. Why? Because the questions are expensive for them to produce, and they've got to test them out and validate them before they ever appear on a scored exam. And so when unreleased content is compromised or stolen, it doesn't just affect one test date, it affects several future administrations where they would likely be reusing that content. And the remote testing also creates structural pressure because when they are administering an exam across multiple days and remotely as well, they can't give the exact same single test form to everybody. So they've got to have multiple test forms for each administration, which then increases the demand for secure material. And so moving back to in-person testing will improve LSAC's control over the testing environment and reduce the vulnerability of the test. Of course, it doesn't eliminate every single risk, but it does lower systemic pressure. And the LSAT only works if law schools trust it, if they can rely on the integrity and validity of those earned official scores. So we've got to be realistic here, though. Moving back to in-person testing doesn't eliminate all security risks because no standardized test is ever going to be perfectly secure. In-person environments can reduce large-scale coordination and make certain forms of cheating much harder, but they aren't going to create a zero-risk system. What the move back to in-person testing is doing, though, is it's reducing the scale of the cheating and the vulnerability of the system to cheating. It makes it harder for the cheating rings to capture that unreleased content. It increases LSAC's control over the testing environment, and it lowers their pressure on having to produce new test forms. It's a meaningful step, not a magic fix, though, but it is certainly going to help. Now, in their announcement, LSAC did note that remote test takers account for about 40% of all test takers, but they account for the majority of the score holds when there is a delay in giving a test taker their official score back. And most of the serious technical disruptions also happen remotely. So this move doesn't just reduce misconduct, it's also reducing score delays, tech issues, and the uncertainty around when people are going to get their scores back. And this change begins with the August 2026 LSAT. The April and June upcoming administrations are unaffected. So if you want to take it remotely, your last chances to do so are 2 months from now in April or 4 months from now in June. If you're taking it beyond that in August, it's probably going to be in person. And registration for the August LSAT and beyond is going to open up in mid-May. And so note carefully, if you want to take it remotely, if taking it remotely appeals to you, if that's your preference, then you've only got 2 months till April or 4 months till June as your likely last chance. If you're targeting the August 2026 LSAT or beyond, assume you're going to be testing in a center. And that changes the logistics because test center capacity is already pretty difficult. It's in pretty high demand. And so you're going to want to book your test center early. When remote's been available and 40% of people are opting for that, the capacity constraints were less visible because people were distributed across some at home, some in person. When everyone's taking it in person, there's more demand for that limited number of testing seats. And so don't wait till the last week to book your slot. If you've got specific location preferences, travel constraints, or scheduling limitations, plan ahead. And you would be surprised, but even in major cities, there are very few testing centers. I'm talking about cities like New York or Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago. And so book those centers early. You don't want to have to rent a hotel room or travel several hours night before or morning of to take your LSAT. So just what I'm saying is be proactive. Now, when you're practicing, remember, you're going to have distractions of other test takers, the proctors being there in person. So get comfortable with taking it in a controlled environment with some noise around you and taking it with other people in your space. And there's also a psychological layer here that most people aren't even thinking about yet. When you take it remotely at home, you've got this sense of control because you control the lighting, the temperature, the chair, the desk, the room. You're in a familiar space. When you're taking it in person, things are less familiar. You're in a shared environment. You're hearing people typing. You're hearing other people moving around in their chairs. Maybe they're sniffling or coughing or sneezing. You might not like the desk. You might not like the room temperature. None of that changes your skills, of course, but it can affect your performance if you're not ready for it. If all of your practice tests happen in a perfect home environment, then you're walking into a structured testing center on game day that's unfamiliar. Your score can drop even if your ability has not dropped. So for your practice tests, take them in a public space every now and then, a library, a coffee shop. Reduce your control over your environment. Be ready for the unexpected. Because at the highest levels of this exam, the top 1% scores 175 plus, the difference is often your ability to maintain emotional stability under pressure. It's no longer just raw logic. And if you strongly prefer remote testing and you don't qualify for accommodations, if you cannot demonstrate extreme hardship in having to travel in person, this is a real timeline decision. You ideally would then want to knock out the LSAT before the change. Now, there's also a new testing platform coming. Beginning in August 2026, along with the return to solely in-person testing, LSAC is introducing a new test delivery platform inside LawHub. The user interface is meant to be less prone to cheating. And they're going to release an interactive model of the new interface by the end of March. And they'll be releasing updated practice tests in the new interface by May. And they're describing the changes as being minor, but they're still significant enough that they felt it was worth making an announcement and releasing a whole new platform that you can practice with. So you want to get familiar with that new interface to mitigate any hesitation or stress that you're experiencing, because your stress costs you time and the time costs you points. And at the elite score level, even just 1 or 2 points can significantly change your admissions and scholarship outcomes. Now, some people are asking, with all the LSAT cheating, with the format changes, the user interface change, the in-person testing, will this push law schools toward the GRE? But there's no signal of that here. Very few people, very few, I'm talking less than 2% of law school students get in with their GRE score. Nearly everybody is getting in with the LSAT score. And if anything, LSAC clamping down on the cheating, taking concrete steps to eliminate it, like going back to in-person, releasing a new, more robust interface, that is reinforcing the credibility of the LSAT, because the US News rankings rely on LSAT medians, scholarships rely on LSAT medians, and admissions uses the LSAT to compare applicants across different undergraduate institutions and different grading systems. The LSAT is demonstrated to be valid because it's strongly correlated with first-year law school grades as well as bar passage rates. And so anything that strengthens the integrity of the LSAT will strengthen the LSAT's role in admissions. Now, there is a fair question to be asked about the rising LSAT score inflation, because over the past several years, 170 plus LSAT scores have become much more common. And some of those higher scores are legit, of course. More people prepping harder, more people retaking, more LSAT accommodations as well. But part of that is likely due to the rise in LSAT cheating as well, due to the availability of remote testing, because any remote test especially is hackable. And so there is a reasonable question to be asked as to whether the cheating had a measurable effect at the extreme high end of the score distribution. Because even if a small percentage of artificially elevated scores existed, tighter security and in-person administrations could compress the top of the curve, reducing the prevalence of high LSAT scores. This doesn't mean that high scores are going to disappear, but if 172 and 175 plus scores become even slightly less saturated, that may lead elite scores to carry stronger signaling power again. In other words, small differences at the top are going to matter a lot more, and that will make it easier to get more scholarship money and get a full ride, especially for those of you who earned your scores legitimately. Now, there is another practical implication here that people aren't yet talking about, which is retake behavior may change. When remote testing was widely available, retaking the LSAT was logistically easier because you don't need to travel to take it remotely. It's a more familiar environment, less friction to take it again, and that would make it easier for people to take it more times. But when in-person testing becomes the default, retakes require more coordination. You've got to travel. You've got to schedule more logistics around all of it. You've got to make sure you can find an in-person center that's available for you. You might have to take more time off from work or from school. Doesn't mean that most people won't retake, but it will reduce the prevalence of retaking, because anytime you make something more difficult at all, you're going to reduce the extent to which people take advantage of it. So if fewer people are sitting for repeat attempts purely because it was convenient and now no longer is quite as convenient, that could modestly affect how crowded the top end of the score scale feels over time. Now, there's also a broader institutional signal in this move, because LSAC didn't have to shift back to in-person testing. Nobody forced them to do it. Remote testing is more convenient, gives students more flexibility, lowers certain barriers to entry, and it's also cheaper for LSAC. So there's less cost associated with them not having to reserve in-person testing center seats, allowing it to be administered online, one proctor for potentially dozens of people at the same time, more money in LSAC's pocket. But LSAC has chosen to prioritize in-center testing because they want to signal that they value the long-term credibility of the LSAT over short-term convenience. And that matters a lot to law schools. So this decision tells law schools that LSAC is willing to absorb some friction and take a hit to their bottom line in order to protect the integrity and reputation of the LSAT. Because in high-stakes admissions like the LSAT, institutional trust is everything. So bottom line, if you want to take the LSAT remotely as a general option, April and June 2026 are your last realistic chances. Starting in August, in-center testing becomes the default. The content remains the same, the skills, the stakes, nothing in there changes. What changes is only where you take it. But if you're taking it in August or beyond, prepare like you're going to take it at a testing center, because you probably will be. And if you'd like my help preparing for the LSAT, whether you're taking it in April or June, either in person or remote, or going forward August and beyond, probably in person, I'm happy to help you out. I'm offering free LSAT tutoring lessons for everybody watching this now or later. The link to book that free lesson with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. The link to book the lesson is below this video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and Instagram. That is an open offer for anyone. I'm happy to help you out, help you craft your plan of attack for your LSAT prep, wherever you're at, whether you're taking it remotely or in person, whether you're starting off at a 140 or a 150 or a 120 or a 160. Doesn't really matter. I want to help you get from your current score to your goal score on your time frame, help you reach your goals, help you hit your target goals. I'm here to support you. And by the way, folks, if you find these lives helpful, I do these every single weekday, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific, here on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, wherever you're watching this. I don't do any advertising for these lives, and the algorithm doesn't really boost them because they can't run any ads during them. So I do appreciate your support, spreading the word. Please spread the word in your group chats, Discords, subreddits, Facebook groups. I really do appreciate your sharing this to your socials. The more this grows, the more I will expand these over time. I do enjoy doing them, but I do appreciate your support in supporting more students with free LSAT prep. I see a ton of questions here in the chat. I'll get to as many of these as I can over the course of this live. Feel free to keep dropping them in. Kay says, not gonna lie, I thought it was all in person anyways, so this doesn't affect me. Yeah, so the LSAT was in person for decades until the pandemic. They moved it online starting with May 2020 for the temporary LSAT Flex format, and it's been online ever since then. But starting in August, I think it was August 2024 now, they started offering it either in person or remotely. So they brought back the in-person option. And now they're going back to in-person entirely due to the cheating. So lots of LSAT changes in recent years. I kind of liked when they gave people the option of either in-person or remote. I think that was the best of both worlds because you gave people the option for either, and optionality is always nice. Remote has its advantages to being more convenient, and that is actually part of what I think contributed to the LSAT score inflation, because LSAC underestimated how much better people would do when they didn't have the stressful environment of having to take it in person with other people around you. Because when you're taking it with other test takers around, other proctors in person, it can make for a more stressful experience. But perhaps what LSAC wasn't expecting is that those organizations running cheating rings are really good at cheating. They would have proxy test takers take over your device, take the LSAT for you. They would also capture the unreleased LSAT exam content and then sell the unreleased questions to students who couldn't afford a proxy test taker. The whistleblower who raised the story on this and spread the word about this happening reported that they were charging up to $8,000 to have someone take the LSAT for you. And then if you couldn't afford that, you could still study off of the unreleased exam questions, because LSAC reuses unreleased questions several times since it's expensive to write new LSAT questions from scratch. But of course, this poses a serious security risk and compromises the integrity of the LSAT. So I think they really had no choice but to return to in-person only. I wish it weren't necessary, but of course it ultimately was. And the rise in LSAT cheating, I think, is part of what contributed to the LSAT score inflation. So I've been pushing for them to go back to in-person ever since the story broke about the LSAT cheating, and took them a couple months to announce this, but ultimately I'm glad to see them make the move. I wish they were able to go live with the change sooner, but big institutions move slowly, and so they probably couldn't get the test center capacity from Prometric for another couple months. And so the soonest they could bring this to life was this August. So bottom line, if you do want to take it remotely from home, your last chance is either April or June of this year. Beyond that, it's going to be in person only unless you have medical accommodations requiring remote, or you can make the case to LSAC that taking it in person would pose an extreme hardship for you, perhaps because you're located really, really far from any available in-person testing center. Alec asks, do you think they'll ever go back to the online option? So do I think they'll ever return to remote testing? I can't see them doing it anytime in the foreseeable future, just because cheating is the sort of thing where it's an arms race, right? You have the institutions like LSAC, the Law School Admission Council, that want to prevent cheating at all costs. Then you have hackers and those who are tech savvy who want to sell access to cheating services and proxy test takers. And the thing is that the cheaters, the hackers, they can probably move faster because they're smaller and have less bureaucratic overhead than LSAC does. And so they can probably circumvent the cheating protections faster than LSAC can put up more walls and more cheating protections. And so I think it's the sort of thing where hackers are always going to be one step ahead. And now that LSAC is aware of the extent of the issue, I can't see them putting themselves in a vulnerable position again where they will basically be a laughing stock and the integrity of the LSAT's called into question. So no, I don't see them going back to remote anytime soon. I think that they just need to get their in-person testing centers with give them wider availability. In other words, to make sure that everyone has the option to take it in person, more geographic coverage ideally. But no, I don't see them going back to remote because just the story's gotten out, it's gotten too big, and too many people have been cheating most likely. And LSAC is probably not going to reveal the extent of the cheating to which it occurred because that would be a major blow to their reputation. And they may not even know the extent of it, but it's big enough that they're not going to risk it again, I don't think. Devon's asking, how were people cheating? So two ways. I think there were basically someone who wants to hire someone else to take it. So let's say John wants to hire people to take the LSAT for him. He goes to one of these organized cheating rings that were advertising on certain online forums and find a service that provides a proxy test taker that where you install some software on your computer. They take the LSAT remotely for you under your name. They're controlling the software interface for you, choosing the right answers. And they're also at the same time using screen recording software to capture all of the content of these unreleased questions. And then they are selling the unreleased questions on online forums at a cheaper price to anyone who wants advance notice of what may be on the exam than the test takers who cannot afford the proxy test taker would study the unreleased questions, basically getting a heads up of what's likely to be on the exam. And then when they see the questions for real, they already know what the answer is going to be because they memorized the answers already. And so LSAC needs to produce a larger volume of unreleased content and make sure that's only being offered August and beyond when it's not remote anymore so that people are not going to be able to steal the content the same way. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I see Electric Barbie is asking, is there a score that large firms are going to see and want to hire you immediately? So law firms are probably hiring more on the basis of your JD, where you earned it, like which law school you went to, rather than your LSAT score in particular. So they're going to place more value on whether you went to Harvard or Yale or Stanford or some other top 14 law school, rather than your particular LSAT score out of 180. But surprisingly, more and more law firms are also asking for folks' LSAT scores. I'm not really sure why they are. I don't think it has that much relevance to your ability as an attorney. The LSAT is considered a valid and reliable admission test specifically because it is strongly correlated with first-year law school grades as well as bar passage rates. But there are so many other skills that go into making a successful attorney, like your people skills, social intelligence, work ethic, ability to network and generate business for the firm. Your knowledge of the law. The LSAT doesn't test your legal knowledge, it tests your ability to evaluate a dense, difficult text, navigate arguments, but I don't think that your LSAT score in particular has a lot of bearing on your success as an attorney in particular. So I don't think it's a good question for them to ask. But if they see a lot of indications that law schools are taking other factors into consideration aside from LSAT, then they may want to see a more objective metric, perhaps. But then there's also your law school grades. Regardless, of course, I mean, higher LSAT scores are going to be perceived better. For reference, a 170 out of 180 puts you in the top 4% of all test takers. And so that's considered a pretty good threshold or benchmark for having a top level or elite score. I see SGA is asking, do you think the LSAT has gotten harder since taking out logic games? If anything, I think maybe the LSAT's gotten easier since they removed logic games because there's less material to study now. Used to be you had to study 3 different sections: logic games, logical reasoning, and reading comprehension. And with the removal of logic games and the replacement of games with a second scored logical reasoning section, there's less material to study. So you can narrow your focus. You double down on logical reasoning since it's 2/3 of the test, and now any gains you make in your understanding of logical reasoning are doubled across the 2 sections. And so that is probably another factor that has led to the rising LSAT scores, the so-called LSAT score inflation. Because less material to study, more focus on the logical reasoning, which is 2/3 of the test, you can make bigger improvements when you can narrow your focus. And so ever since LSAC removed logic games, we actually changed our courses and our coaching at LSAT Unplugged to give logical reasoning more focus. We immediately pulled all logic games material from our curriculums, and we added a whole lot more on logical reasoning. And so if you were to join one of our LSAT coaching programs, you're going to see now that we're devoting roughly 2/3 of your study time of your syllabus to logical reasoning. In particular, the 3 most common types of logical reasoning questions: necessary assumption, inference, and flaw, because those are the most common logical reasoning question types. We don't want to focus on the rare types that hardly ever show up, even if you hate them, because you're not going to get as much return on your time invested there. In contrast, focusing on higher yield areas will get you a quicker score boost. And for folks asking how much time you need to prepare for the LSAT, I mean, you could knock it out in 2 to 3 months and be ready by April if you're studying for the LSAT full time, since we're now only in mid-February. But ideally, you want to give yourself 4 to 6 months to achieve your fullest potential on the LSAT. And so I would recommend, if you're brand new to the LSAT, go for June, giving you 4 months, go for August, giving you 6 months. Take a more slow and steady approach in each section, each question type. Logical reasoning, there are roughly 15 different types of logical reasoning questions. The 3 most common types are necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. But then you've also got strengthen, weaken, parallel, resolve, role of statement, conclusion. You've also got reading comprehension to work on. Then there's pacing and time management, doing individual sections, and full-length exams to build up your endurance. And so whenever you're taking the LSAT, we look at your current score, your goal score, and your time frame, and we craft for you a personalized study plan to get you from here to there over that period of time. And if you want to talk through what your personal study plan could look like, for those of you just joining, you can book a free LSAT tutoring lesson with me personally. The link to book that free lesson is unpluggedprep.com/start. The link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and Instagram as well. Again, that's an open offer for everybody watching this now and later. I see a question from Caitlin asking, how do you think the range of scoring will differ now that it's only in person? So I think that if the in-person only reduces the prevalence of LSAT cheating, which it probably will, since remote testing was likely the cause of all the cheating. In other words, it made the LSAT more vulnerable to allow people to take it on their own devices from home with less oversight from proctors, letting people use their own computers, which they could install maybe some secret software on to facilitate the cheating. I think it's going to reduce the cheating, and as a result, reduce the prevalence of high scores, because a large part of the LSAT score inflation in recent years is probably a direct result of all the cheating that's been going on. So if you reduce the cheating, you reduce the high scores, you reduce the LSAT score inflation, fewer people getting top scores. Additionally, fewer LSAT retakes, because retaking will become less convenient, will also reduce the prevalence of high scores. So fewer people earning high scores means less LSAT score inflation, meaning LSAT score medians will reduce. LSAT score medians have been rising year over year for the past several years. The top 14 law schools now have LSAT medians of 170 to 174, which is outrageous in my opinion. And a lot of that is due to the LSAT cheating, due to the more frequent LSAT retakes. For those who aren't aware, back in 2018, the LSAT was offered only 4 times a year. In 2019, 2020, They doubled the frequency of LSAT administrations to be 8 times a year, meaning there's always another LSAT retake opportunity around the corner. And so more retakes means higher scores because it's more convenient. You're not delaying your applications by an entire cycle, given that you can always just take it another month or two from now. So for example, in the past, somebody who was going to take the LSAT in, say, December would have to wait till February to retake it. Now they could take it in January and February. Or somebody taking it in January would have had to wait another couple months. Now they can just take it in February, so not have to wait an entire year. So all this to say, I think that we will see a reduction in high scores, reduction in LSAT meetings as a result, meaning that if you earn a high LSAT score, you're going to be more unique as a result, and that might carry more weight. It might be more valuable since those high scores are less common. And by the way, folks, for those of you just joining now, the recordings of all of these lives, including today's live, is on the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel. If you click the link in my bio on TikTok or Instagram or anywhere else, you'll be able to click through to the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel where you'll see the recording of this live and all the previous lives. There are literally hundreds of them, as well as thousands of other videos on the channel covering everything LSAT and law school admissions. I see a question from ISAM asking, do you believe law schools will accept lower than their median score since the 170 LSAT median is possibly from the cheating? Unfortunately not. So basically, this is going to take several years to shake out fully because people who got official high LSAT scores, their scores are good for 5 years. And there are a lot of people who take the LSAT 1 year but don't apply for another year or two. Or they apply, they don't like their admissions offers, they apply again the following year. So people with high scores, their scores are still valid, and they're going to remain in the applicant pool for a couple of years at the minimum, and their scores are valid for 5 years. And law schools don't want to take folks with lower LSAT scores because that's going to hurt their medians. Law schools, like anyone else, are rational actors who respond to incentives. And for law schools, their incentive is to consider the highest LSAT score on an applicant's record. And law schools don't know whether the score is valid or not. They don't know whether it's from cheating or not. They don't know whether you had extra time accommodations or not. All they know is that score out of 180. And that score is what they report to the American Bar Association, which in turn is where US News pulls their data from for inclusion in the rankings. So maybe 5 years from now, starting with the August 2026 LSAT when it goes back to in-person only, and we hopefully see a significant reduction in cheating, count forward 5 years from then, August 2031, that will be when there are no more people who took the LSAT remotely, with very few exceptions. And so we can expect then that we will see a reduction in the high LSAT scores, reduction in LSAT score inflation, at least insofar as cheating contributed to the score inflation. But you probably want to go to law school sometime sooner if you're watching this now. You probably want to just get the LSAT over with, apply to law school. 5 years from now, you're already going to be done. You already have your JD, pass the bar, become a successful attorney, right? So this is really only going to help folks years from now. In the short term, there is score inflation. There are folks applying to law school right now who earned their scores illegitimately, and LSAC doesn't know who those people are. They might have some guesses as to who they are, but they can't say for certain, and they can't prove it. So they might be able to do some probabilistic guesses there. They might be able to look back at any software. Maybe they can dig deeper into the analytics. I'm not sure whether they will. One reason for the rise in LSAT score holds and LSAT score delays is due to all the questionable circumstances under which the LSAT was administered. In other words, they want to figure out whether the person cheated or not. They can't say for certain, but they want to do some digging around a little bit. And they do sometimes cancel scores if there are security irregularities. I did a video a few weeks back on the YouTube channel about the LSAT score delays and the causes of those. And by the way, folks, if you want to pursue remote testing starting in August, and you want to be one of the folks who claims extreme hardship or medical accommodations that would necessitate taking it remotely, that may put you at increased risk of getting your score held or flagged for review, leading to a delay in you getting your score back and a delay and in you submitting your applications. Because if you're taking it remotely, that puts you under a bit of extra scrutiny and suspicion, because the question is, why are you taking it remotely? Could be legit, or it could be that maybe they're thinking that you were one of the attempted cheaters, for all they know. Since probably I would expect that 99% of cheating instances occur with remote tests, because are you really going to try and install software on an in-person prometric testing device? Are you going to bring a USB key into a testing center, try to install some sketchy software on there with an in-person proctor right there? Seems pretty unlikely to me. Much more likely that folks are going to do that on their own computer from home, where there's less scrutiny. And so I think LSAT really wants to lock down the remote testing, keep it to a serious minimum, and only allow it in extreme circumstances. Happy to address follow-ups, of course. But yeah, I think that the safer route here for everybody is just go in person. I think that it has its drawbacks, of course, but if it can nip the cheating in the bud, it's a good thing that they're pursuing this to maintain the integrity of the test. I see some questions here from older or so-called non-traditional law school applicants. I see Rosie or Rosie's asking, is 36 too late to start law school? I've been a paralegal for more than 10 years. I see Vanilla Bell's asking, what's your take on going to law school closer to 40? I'm not interested in big law. So first of all, 36 is not too old. 40 is not too old either. Plenty of folks go to law school at 40, 50, 60 years old and beyond. Law schools love older applicants. They bring more life experience to the table. You're clearly not going to law school on a whim or for lack of a better option. You're going because you're serious about pursuing law. And you may have some real world experience with the law or exposure to the practice of law. As Rosie's saying, worked as a paralegal. So what you want to do is you want to highlight any legal background you have in your application essays, on your resume, in your personal statement, in your letters of rec. Show that you know what law school is actually like, what the practice of law is actually like, that your understanding is beyond that of someone who just binge watched Suits and fell in love with law, right? So you want to highlight that in your application throughout. And the good news, or at least could be good news, is that the longer it's been since you were in undergrad, the less emphasis they place on your undergraduate GPA and the more emphasis they place on your LSAT score. So if who you were at 20 doesn't reflect who you are at 40, and you're presumably wiser, more mature, taking academics more seriously than you did back then, and your GPA back then is a bit weaker than it should have been, that's okay. You can offset all of that with a higher LSAT score. And I speak for myself here as well. My GPA at undergrad did not reflect what I was capable of. I didn't take undergrad seriously enough. And if I could do it over again, I would have tried a lot harder. The good news is that if you can study hard for the LSAT now, get a much higher LSAT score than your undergrad GPA would suggest, you can say to them, hey, my GPA does not reflect my true academic potential. It was a long time ago. Look at who I am now. And you don't actually need to say that in an addendum. The numbers will speak for themselves. So basically, they discount your undergrad GPA. They place a lot more weight on your LSAT score. And of course, they give a bit more weight to your work experience as well. So in other words, undergrad GPA diminishes in importance. It gets a smaller slice of the pie. Your LSAT gets a much larger slice of the pie. And also they carve out some space for your letters of rec, your application essays, and your resume. And I have some videos on the YouTube channel as well talking through admissions for non-traditional students. And if you want to talk through the particulars and the unique challenges that you might be facing when it comes to the LSAT, you could book the free LSAT tutoring lesson with me. I'm happy to talk it through with you personally. The link to book that free call with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. The link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and Instagram as well. Open offer for everybody watching this now and later. I see Anastasia's asking, what is the ideal score range for scholarship eligibility? So it's all relative. Your ability to get a scholarship for law school, to get merit financial aid, is tied specifically to your ability to apply with numbers above the medians of the law schools to which you're applying. And so if you are applying to a law school where their LSAT medians of 165, and you apply with a 170 LSAT score or a 175 LSAT score, you are a relatively stronger applicant. Your numbers are competitive on the LSAT front. The higher your LSAT score is above the median, the more likely you are to get scholarship money and the more money you will actually get. Of course, there's also GPA to consider as well, right? It's not just LSAT, it's also GPA. And so if your GPA is below the median, but your LSAT is above the median, they can cancel out. In other words, you can offset a relatively lower GPA with a relatively higher LSAT score. And so if your GPA is below the 25th percentile of a given law school's median, then you want to target an LSAT score above the 75th percentile of a given law school's LSAT median. And you can look up the exact targets or medians on the American Bar Association's website. In the 509 reports, they publish the LSAT median and the GPA median for every single ABA-approved law school, every single one of the American Bar Association accredited law schools. And so you'll see what kind of numbers you would need to be competitive at a given law school. And if your GPA is lower but your LSAT is higher, that makes you a so-called splitter applicant. Now, as Dawson's asking in the chat here, what about the reverse? What if you have a lower LSAT with a higher GPA? It works the same way. So everything I said, vice versa, also applies. If you have a low LSAT, you can offset it with a higher GPA. The problem, though, is that law schools weigh your LSAT score more heavily than your undergraduate GPA. So it's a lot easier to offset a low GPA with a high LSAT than it is to offset a low LSAT with a high GPA. The other thing is that your GPA is largely set in stone if you are a junior or a senior in college, or if you've already graduated. In other words, it's really hard to improve your GPA because you earn it over such a long period of time. You're earning it over the course of typically 3 to 4 years. And so even if you slacked for 3.5 years, then gun it for one semester, that one semester is only approximately 1/8 of undergrad. So you're not going to raise your GPA that much. And it's really hard to redo classes from undergrad. It's quite time consuming and costly. Tuition's not cheap in most cases, right? But your LSAT score is a single day, 2.5 hours, one sitting. And that weighs more heavily than all of undergrad combined. And so if you have a high GPA and a low LSAT, my thought is, let's just raise your LSAT score. Let's study for a couple months. You can retake the LSAT. You can take it 5 times in 5 years, and it's offered 8 times a year. So if you're sitting here right now and you're like, I took the LSAT and my score wasn't good, I'm like, well, you've got 2 months till April. You've got 4 months till June. You could take either one of those LSATs or both of them and apply the second applications open this fall. And if you can raise your LSAT score, you can then apply this fall with both a high GPA and a high LSAT. And if your GPA is low, that's okay. You'll be a splitter with a low GPA and a high LSAT score. But raising your LSAT score is the #1 best thing you could do to improve your odds for admission. And you could knock it out in just a couple months. Retaking could be as simple as taking 1 practice test a week, reviewing it in depth. And if you retake through luck alone, you could do better. If your practice test average was a 165 and you took the LSAT and you got a 165, you could say that you got what you deserved and that you're done with it. But you could also say to yourself, you know what? I could retake it and maybe get lucky. Because there's a margin of error or a score band of 3.5 points on each end. So one day you get a 168, one day you get a 162, one day you get a 165. But the truth is that a 168 will get you better outcomes than a 165 would. And if you actually studied pretty hard and raised your baseline understanding, you could break into the 170s. And 170s is going to do you a lot better than a 165 will. And AdComs themselves, admissions people, they are susceptible to the optics of a 170 looking a lot better than a 169. even though it's just 1 point, the data shows that at that threshold, crossing into the 170s, they value that at more than 1 point, meaning that the 170 looks prettier. They love to see it too. And so if you can break into that range, it's going to do a lot of good things for you. I see a question here asking, when does registration for the August LSAT open? So registration for all the test dates, August, September, October, November, and beyond, registration opens up in mid-May. But then scheduling a specific date and time opens up about 2 weeks prior. And you're really going to want to jump on that registration because it's been hard enough to book a date and time when both remote and in-person testing were available. But now that only in-person will be available, in most cases, it's going to be really hard to reserve a good spot. And you would think there's lots of test centers available, but there actually aren't that many. Like in New York City, for example, there's like 4 prometric testing centers in all the 5 boroughs. It's just insane. In other words, they don't have the capacity to support the demand. And I'm expecting they will probably open up more capacity than they have in the past, just because there's going to be more demand because remote's being virtually eliminated. But still, you're going to want to set your alarm clock, jump online the second it opens, and just keep hitting refresh like it's Taylor Swift's concert tickets. It's crazy, but this is the world we live in, and their software is not the best. So you're going to want to keep hitting refresh and block off some time on your schedule to deal with this. I see a question from Dawson asking, what are your thoughts on score cancellations? Cancellations are really a relic of back when law schools averaged multiple LSAT scores. They no longer do. They only take the highest score on record, so it doesn't really matter whether you cancel your score or not. I know nobody likes to hear that, but it's the truth. If it's a low score, doesn't look good. If it's a cancellation, they're going to assume it probably wasn't a good score, because if it was good, why would you have canceled it? Doesn't matter. Follow-up question here I see, how does it look taking it 3 or 4 times? Doesn't really matter. Again, law schools only take into consideration the highest score on your record. They don't average multiple LSAT scores. Of course, ideal world, you would take it one and done. That's rarely the case though. And I recommend that unless you achieve above your potential, above what you think you deserved, you might as well retake, because you could get lucky and do better. And if you don't, no big deal. Law schools have no incentive to care about how many times you took it, because they are not evaluated based on that metric. They are only evaluated based on the highest score that you have on your record, because that's what they report to the ABA, which in turn is where US News gets their data from for the rankings. And so it's well worth retaking unless you scored above your potential in your expectation. I see some questions here asking about when should you take it? If you want to take it in August, should you also take it in June? So yeah, I mean, I think that it's worth taking it multiple times, right? So coming up, we have this calendar year, 2026, we have April, June, August, September, October, and November. April and June are the last 2 where you can take it remotely. August, September, October, November, in person only with rare exceptions. So you might want to do April as your target with June as a backup. You might want to do June as your target with August as a backup. And given the change in formats, given that this is your last chance to take it remotely, you might want to take it remotely in June and then in person in August. Then you've got multiple formats you're trying out as well. So in other words, if you're not sure, will you do better remote or do better in person? Maybe you say to yourself, you know what? I am in a unique, advantageous situation this year because I can try out both styles. I can try out remote, try out in person, see which one I do better in. And if you think you'll do better in remote, then you definitely want to take it at least once remote while you still can, given that this is your last chance to do so. Because once August hits, in person only as the option. Additionally, this gives you multiple takes because, of course, multiple at-bats, more likely you'll do better on at least one of them. In other words, maybe you'll do better than you deserve on at least one of them, more at-bats, more chances to score higher. And so while all attempts will appear on your score report, law schools only take into consideration the highest score on your record. So if you have a low score followed by a high, the high score counts. If it's high followed by low, the high still counts anyway. And if you actually study between retakes, maybe you can also raise your baseline understanding and do better because you had more time to study. I know there were some questions I skipped through here. I'm just going to try and circle back to those. See, Devon's asking, do you think doing teen court in high school would be acceptable to put on an application? I wouldn't put it on your application because we're in the big leagues now, man. We're applying to law school. High school is old news. You've got to have enough things on your resume post high school to fill up your resume. So do some volunteer work, do some extracurriculars, get some work experience, do some internships, but it is not considered appropriate to put anything from high school on your law school application resume. Remember, you're competing with our applicants who are 36 years old, 40 plus, who have decades of work experience working as paralegals. Teen court is going to seem like a joke to them. And I'm not saying that it is, of course. I think it's cool that you did it, but you've got to have more recent things on your application to include at this stage in your life. Because who you were at 15, 16 is not who you are at 21, 22. So include more recent, more relevant things on your application. If you don't have them, then go out and do something to include. But also don't over-index on the soft factors or the applications or the resumes, because ultimately what matters most is your LSAT score and your GPA. And so I would rather you have a higher LSAT score and a slightly emptier resume than have a lower score but have gone out and done something just to put it on your resume, like an internship or something. So I hope that helps you out on that one. But yeah, focus on the LSAT score first and foremost. Nothing from high school, period. I see Sabrina's asking, wait, what about LSAT for blind students? How are we not going to do remote? Okay, so LSAC said, so couple things. First of all, if you're a blind LSAT test taker, contact LSAC. They're going to help you out. They're going to bend over backwards to help you out because they got sued by blind test takers, which led to the removal of LSAT logic games altogether. And so they're scared of you and they're going to help you out. Secondly, LSAC has said that there will be exceptions to the ban on remote testing, specifically for those with medical accommodations. And so if for some reason being sight impaired means that you cannot take the LSAT in person, LSAC will likely allow you to take the LSAT remotely, given the accommodations. If you look at their blog post, they said specifically medical accommodations. So that might include being blind, but contact them for details. The email address is lsacinfo@lsac.org. Contact them sooner rather than later because it takes a while for them to get back to folks. They have not specified what exactly the medical accommodations would look like. So I can't say if it's going to be this or that would allow the remote testing specifically. They're a bit hazy on the details right now because it is a new announcement. It just came out yesterday, but reach out to them and I'm sure they'll be able to clarify with plenty of notice. I mean, the August LSAT is 6 months from now, so they've got plenty of time to work out the details here. I see a question asking, I'm stuck at 152 for 6 months and cannot raise my score. Do you think I can raise it to 158 by June? So yeah, you're asking, can you raise your score by 6 points in 4 months? Absolutely. And to be frank, it's a lot easier to go from a 152 to a 158 than from a 172 to a 178. And so if you've plateaued, there is a way to break through that plateau. We just got to figure out what's lacking in your prep. We got to change the variables to change the equation, right? And so this is something I would love to discuss with you more personally because there's probably some gap in your prep approach. And if we can figure out what that gap is, we can help you get unstuck. And there's usually a quick score boost to be had. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit when you haven't been getting the personalized feedback because when you're studying on your own, you don't know what you don't know. And so book the free LSAT lesson with me and we could talk through it more. That's an open offer for everybody, by the way. The link to book the free one-on-one tutoring with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. The link is below this video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and Instagram as well. And by the way, folks, if you find these lives helpful, I do them every single weekday, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific. If you find this helpful, please spread the word. The only way this grows is through word of mouth. Share it to your socials, share it on your Facebook groups, Discords, group chats, subreddits. I do appreciate your support. I'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care. Thanks for joining.